Okay, first of all, can you believe this? This is fabulous how many people have come out tonight to discuss a war that started actually 200 years ago. Boy, we're really close, about 5 days away from the actual declaration of war.
Suspense is building.
Yes, it is. First question is obvious, and it's right from the title of the book. I think we have not traditionally thought of this war as a civil war. We have thought of it as us against them. Mm-hmm. Where did the notion that this was actually a civil war, how did that come to you?
Well, it came to me when I started investigating who lived in Upper Canada, the Ontario of the past, and I found out that something on the order of 2/3 of the people who lived here in 1812 were migrants from the United States. And they weren't the true loyalists, that 2/3. There certainly were true loyalists here who had come during the 1780s, but they were mostly a later group of migrants known as the late loyalists. And so their experience when American forces invade Upper Canada is that of a civil war, in that they are being invaded by people who used to be their neighbors and in some cases used to be their friends.
I think it was back on the 5th that the House of Representatives passed the declaration of war. It then went to the Senate, they passed it, and then on the 18th, I think, is the 200th anniversary of President Madison's actually signing it. That sounds like there was a lot of support for this war in the United States, particularly in high government circles. Is that the case?
Well, there was in high government circles because there was one party that controlled the government of the United States. It was the Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, not quite the same thing as today's Republican Party. But that Republican Party was about 81% of the members of that party in Congress voted for the declaration of war. But the opposition party voted unanimously against it, so it was not a bipartisan war. And the opposing party were the Federalists, and they thought that that was a war that was meant as much to discredit the Federalist Party and destroy it in the United States as it was to conquer Canada.
All politics is local.
Or it's across the border as well.
Across the border as well. Let's go through some of the reasons why this thing started in the first place. So we're going to go through a bunch of statements here. How accurate is this statement here? The war began because the Americans simply wanted to take over as much of the North American continent as they could.
That's probably about 10% true.
That's the conventional wisdom, though.
Well, it's probably the conventional wisdom in Canada. And you have reason for it. You did get invaded after all. But the reason why the United States wanted to invade Canada was the leaders of the United States were very upset about British military aid to Indian peoples living within the United States. Now, the British did that because they feared there would be a future war with the United States, and they knew they would need those First Nation peoples as their allies. And so those weapons given to Native peoples enabled them to defend their homelands against American expansion westward. So what the British intended as a defensive measure to help them protect Canada was interpreted in the United States as an act of aggression against the United States. And it became one of the reasons why Americans wanted to invade Canada, was to break up this alliance with Native peoples.
Had the Native peoples not been on the side of the Brits at this time for this war, what might have happened to the British side?
Well, those Native peoples were absolutely essential to the success of the British in defending Canada, particularly in that first year of the war, which was the most difficult one for the defense of Upper Canada, because at that time, in 1812, most of the British troops were tied down in Europe fighting against Napoleon. And they could not send reinforcements to Upper Canada until 1813, and then they sent more in 1814. But during that first year, you had less than 2,000 British troops for this vast province of Upper Canada, extending from Windsor on the west all the way over to Cornwall. And 2,000 troops, that's spreading them pretty thin. Now, of course, you had the militia, but the population of Upper Canada was at most 75,000 people. So you're talking about a militia of maybe 10 to 12,000 people, also spread thin. So what is it that evens it for the defenders of Upper Canada? It's the fact that they could get these Native peoples to ally with them, because these were the most masterful guerrilla fighters in North America.
Let's talk about some domestic American political considerations in all of this. How much concern was there? We have to remember that it's a few decades from this time, America will have a civil war. And the South, I gather, is already looking at the North with suspicious eyes. How much concern was there among the Americans in the South that if the North were to annex Canada, the balance would be somehow at askew?
That's a good point. It's one of the reasons why the United States was actually, and I'm sorry to break this news, they were ambivalent about conquering Canada. There were some people who were quite keen for it, but there were a lot of people, for domestic political reasons within the United States, who thought this would be a mistake. You can read Thomas Jefferson's writings and you would be persuaded that people in Canada lived on ice floes year-round. He wasn't really persuaded that Canada was worth conquering. And then the other fear was the United States was a very tenuous coalition of regions at that time. Southerners did not trust Northerners. Westerners didn't trust Easterners. And so if you're suddenly going to add several potential states to the northern side of the ledger, that gave great pause to these Southern politicians. So their position was, we're going to war for maritime reasons, because the British Navy is interfering with American ships and American sailors. And we're going to grab Canada as a bargaining chip that we will give back to the British in order to get them to make concessions in a peace treaty to end the war. Now, that's not a very appealing message to the people being invaded. We're coming here, we want you to help us, and by the way, if you do help us, you'll become traitors, and we're going to give you back to the people who will consider you traitors. And when Canadians thought about that for a little while, they thought, why should we help you?
Let's follow up on that maritime angle. The British did seize American merchant ships. They stopped other American boats to search for deserters from the Royal Navy, and then there was something called impressment.
Yes.
What was impressment?
Well, the press gang worked throughout the British Empire, that it was a very crude form of conscription, that you would go into a tavern or you'd go onto a ship and you would see a likely-looking sailor, and you would say, it's your unlucky day, you are now in the Royal Navy. And they would haul this guy off, kicking and screaming, and they would put him in the Royal Navy, where conditions were pretty grim. Working conditions, and you're also at danger of being blasted by the Spanish or the French. And pay was low, and the food in the British Navy was exactly as you would imagine it. But then for excitement, you would be flogged regularly. So sailors decided by the thousands that maybe leaving the British Isles and going to the United States and finding higher paying jobs in the American merchant marine was a safer and higher paying occupation. Well, if you're an empire and you're engaged in a world war against the might of Napoleon's empire, you have to have the world's largest navy to protect this island kingdom. You can't afford to be losing thousands of these sailors going off to another country which is getting rich off this war as a neutral carrier of the trade that's no longer safe for the British or the French to carry. So from a British perspective, the Americans are making out like bandits, they're helping Napoleon, and they are stealing all these sailors from the British Empire. British felt fully within their rights to stop these American merchant ships, inspect their crews, take anybody who looked or sounded British, and put them in the Royal Navy. Now, a lot of these people considered themselves naturalized American citizens, and in some cases they were people who had been born in the United States. But if you are the captain of a Royal Navy warship and you're short-handed, you are going to take any able-bodied sailor that you can, and you're not going to take seriously the protests of the United States, which has a Navy which is about 20 warships compared to the 1,000 warships of the Royal Navy.
Okay, so let's go through our checklist here. We've got 10%, you say, had designs on Canadian territory. We've got the issue of impressment and the maritime issues. We've got the Indian Confederacy issues. But let me flip it around, because I don't want to make it sound like, as I learned from your book, that Canada had no designs the other way as well.
Right.
John Graves Simcoe, our first Lieutenant Governor here in the province of Ontario, wanted to crush the Republic and reunite the Empire.
Right.
Now, how much of that attitude was widespread and may have contributed to the British sides wanting to go to war?
Well, it's a widespread sentiment, but I wouldn't say that it's the sentiment of the top leaders, the people in London. People in London, their top priority was to wage war against Napoleon, because the survival of the empire was at stake. And Napoleon was a despot who was dominating Europe at that time. Plus, he was French. And so, from the British perspective, that made him target number one. Now, the Americans, the British leaders didn't much like the Americans. They'd made a lot of trouble in the American Revolution. They seemed like a bunch of ingrates, and they were making a lot of money out of trading with Napoleon's France. So British officers would, in their private letters, often express sentiments to the effect of, this will be a good chance for some payback and teach the Americans some lessons. And they fantasized about the possibility of breaking up the American Union, and perhaps part of that union would choose to rejoin the empire. So that was never the official policy of the government, but for the people who were involved in the war here in North America, a lot of them were hoping that their efforts would lead to the discrediting of the Republican form of government and to the dissolution of the American Union.
Okay, let me continue with this notion of civil war, and you can't tell the players without a program. There are loyalists on both sides of the border. There are Americans on both sides of the border. There are Indian nations on both sides of the border, all fighting against each other. There are Irish on both sides of the border. Irish in the United States who hated Britain. Did that embolden them to want to go to war with Canada?
Absolutely. Probably the most enthusiastic people for war in the United States were Irish Americans. Because Ireland was under the domination of the British. There had been a very bloody, failed rebellion in Ireland in 1798. And it had generated thousands of refugees. And the primary place they went was to the United States. Their political worldview was that of Republicans. And the United States they thought of as the finest country in the world. And once they came to the United States, they settled usually in the seaport cities or near them, especially Philadelphia. And they became very politically active. They were often the editors of Republican newspapers, and they helped to gin up feeling in the United States in favor of war. And they had this concept that if you could start to unravel the British Empire anywhere, it would have a ripple effect that would be felt in Ireland. So that if they could overthrow British rule in Canada, that this would inspire a new rebellion that would liberate Ireland, was their thinking. Now, it becomes very much of a Civil War experience when these troops do invade Upper Canada, and there is a disproportionate number of those soldiers, not a majority, but a higher percentage of those soldiers were Irish American than was their proportion of the American population, because they were highly enthusiastic about this, whereas a lot of other Americans weren't. They crossed the border and they were engaged in combat. It turns out the regiments they were fighting against in 1812, almost all of them had been recruited in Ireland. Ireland was a very poor place. There were a lot of desperate young men. And the one way in which they could get some money and they could get out of Ireland was to enlist in a British Army regiment. The regiments that were posted here in Canada were almost all recruited in Ireland, and most of their troops were Irish. So you had Irish people fighting on both sides in the battles in Canada.
Brother against brother. It really was.
Literally, yes.
There's one other group we haven't mentioned yet, and that is the French Catholic Les Habitants, the French Canadians. Now, did they prefer to be a minority under British rule in present-day Canada, or were they looking to get liberated by the Americans?
If they made a list of liberators, they would not put the Americans on it. There had been an attempt to liberate them by the Americans during the American Revolution, which had not gone well. And they didn't have fond experiences with Americans, who they mostly knew as peddlers and horse thieves who would come across the border. So it was not a good representation of the American character that they were familiar with. Plus, they had mostly made their peace with British rule at that time. They didn't have any fondness for British rule. But they hated Napoleon more, because Napoleon had done things against the Catholic Church and against the Pope. And the British government of Canada had mostly protected the interests of the Catholic Church at that time. So the Catholic hierarchy in Canada was quite clear that preserving British rule was preferable to an American conquest. And so the French Canadians were not much involved in the war. I'm not saying they had no role, but the primary American invasion was into Upper Canada, which was mostly an Anglophone colony. But occasionally American forces would go into Lower Canada, what's now Quebec. And on those occasions, the French Canadians did turn out, and they were very effective against fighting the invaders.
There are deserters, obviously, in every war, but particularly, I guess, given the way you've set this story up as a civil war, it seemed like desertion was an epidemic in this war. There's tons of it.
Yes.
How come so much?
Well, this is a war in which people speak the same languages on both sides. Most of the people are speaking English. And I think it's worth dwelling upon that, because it means that you can persuade people of the other side pretty readily, because you're speaking their language. And people can imagine themselves on the other side. Now, desertion worked a little differently on the two sides. When Americans would run away, sometimes they would go into Upper Canada, often because they had relatives living here, because there were so many Upper Canadians were Americans by birth. More often, Americans are running away to go back home within the United States. When the British soldiers desert, they don't feel it's safe to hide out within Upper Canada. So they will almost always go over to the American forces. And we have to bear in mind that most of these soldiers were Irish. And there was a phenomena of what's called in immigration enlistment. It seems clear that some of these people enlisted in these British regiments to get a free ride across the Atlantic. And their geography was good enough that they knew the United States was next to Canada. And they're just looking for an opportunity to throw the gun down and go across. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not talking about most of those troops. Most of those troops did their duty and stuck it out with the British. But the British officers complained early and often that the ethnicity of most of their deserters was Irish.
I'm just looking for this guy's name in the back of the book because maybe somebody in this room will know. Was he a general? Wilcox. He started with the Canadians, he defected to the other side.
This is where you're all supposed to hiss. Because he was a traitor to Canada.
He was a traitor, and there's a street running through the University of Toronto, Joseph Wilcox, called Wilcox Street. Is that named after that traitorous son of a gun, do you know?
No. Do not go out and tear down those signs. It's named for a relative of his.
Okay, good. Phew.
Who died before the war and would have been loyal even if he had lived.
Okay.
Right. But Joseph Wilcox was a traitor to Canada. He, of course, didn't see it that way. He initially was fighting on behalf of defending the province, and he had been recruited by Isaac Brock, who was politically very shrewd. He was the commanding general and the acting lieutenant governor when the war began, Brock. And he was trying to unite all the factions within Upper Canada. And so he reached out to Wilcox, who had been leading the opposition, and brought him in to the fold. And Wilcox stopped his opposition activities, shut down his newspaper, sold off his press, got a commission, fought at the Battle of Queenston Heights, helped to recruit First Nations people for the war effort. But then in 1813, he suddenly switched and he ran away to the Americans. Well, what happened? Brock got killed. His successor was politically weak. Continued to try to include the opposition, but after York fell to the Americans in April of 1813, that man, Sir Roger Hale Sheaffe, was discredited and sacked. And a more hardline regime came into power politically in Upper Canada and started to arrest people who were perceived to be dissidents. And Wilcox didn't want to be arrested, so he ran away to the Americans, and he organized a unit of other Upper Canadians who were dedicated to overthrowing British rule. So there were some Upper Canadians, led by Wilcox, who were actively fighting against other Upper Canadians, a much larger number, who were defending British rule in Upper Canada.
Let me ask you about military strategy by the Americans, because you've already told us that maritime problems between America and Britain were significant in the reasons behind this war, and yet the Americans really fought this mostly as a land war within our boundaries as opposed to out in the Atlantic. How come?
Well, they can count, and they know they've got 21 warships, and the British have 1,000. Now, that's not to say that those 21 didn't perform some incredible feats, but they cannot wage a war to wrest domination of the North Atlantic away from the British because they just don't have the ships to do that. So they wage a commerce-raiding war in which those 21 warships are trying to slip out through a British blockade, disperse around the seas of the world, and attack British merchant ships. And if they have the opportunity to find a stray single British warship, they will attack it. Now, you can inflict some pain, and certainly it's very bad for public relations for the Royal Navy to ever lose to anybody. They were used to always beating the French and the Spanish. And for these Americans to win an occasional naval victory was very disheartening to the British. So they issued a rule: no more one ship against one ship battles with the Americans. If you have two ships, you're going to attack the Americans, but if you've got one, you avoid it.
Follow-up. There were militarily important locations that the Americans never attacked. There were less significant locations where they spent a great deal of time with ground troops trying to attack.
Right.
And it so happened that there were fairly wealthy American landowners who owned land in the sensitive areas that never saw any action. You want to say there's a connection there or not?
That's incredible.
Isn't that an amazing connection?
Right.
Who had Schlepp and why, I guess, is the question.
Okay. Well, that's a very important question. So the obvious place, if you're an American war planner, and you want to conquer Canada, what do you go after that's the most important place to capture? Well, the two most important places, Montreal and Quebec City, because they will control everything that's upstream. There were no decent roads, so all the supplies, all the reinforcements that are ever going to get to Upper Canada will be cut off if you control Montreal and Quebec City. And that's why the major British force in North America was in Quebec City. The most impressive fortifications in North America were in Quebec City. The British plan was that if they lost everything else in Canada, they would hold up in Quebec City, behind the city walls, and wait for reinforcements to come from Europe. Now, the Americans don't do the obvious thing, which is to go against Montreal and then move on to Quebec City. Instead, they attack Upper Canada, Niagara Peninsula, and Western Upper Canada in particular, which is militarily stupid. So why? Well, part of it is the American army wasn't big enough, wasn't professional enough for the job of taking on Quebec City. And political support in the United States for the war was so shaky that the political calculus was, let's go to the place where we can win quick and easy victories, because then the war will become more popular in the United States, our troops will get experience, we'll recruit more soldiers, and we'll be strong enough in year 2 to move on against Montreal and Quebec. So that's one calculation. The other is the United States needs to borrow money because they don't want to tax the American people. It's something you never want to do if you want to be in political power in the U.S. The governing party wants to run a war. It turns out wars are expensive, but they don't want to tax the American people. So we do what Americans do. We borrow money. The problem is most of the people with money in the United States were Federalists who were opposed to the war and refused to loan their money to the U.S. government. There are a handful of very rich men who are willing to loan money for this war effort. That gave them enormous clout over the U.S. government. One of them owned thousands of acres of land in northern New York, right along the St. Lawrence Valley, which could have been this invasion corridor to go to Montreal. He made very clear to the leadership of the United States, I'm loaning you a lot of money. I do not want your troops going across my properties, because troops do damage when they go through.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I always thought that war was about acquiring territory, but in this case it seemed to be invade, loot, burn down everything in sight, and then often as much leave. What was that all about?
Well, it's not the policy of the U.S. government to go in and burn and loot and leave. But the problem was they would come across, they have raw troops. They have not had proper training. A lot of these people had been on the farm the month before. You give them a gun, you put them out into Canada, they're badly fed, they're badly led, they don't have training, they don't have discipline, they think to be an American man means never to take orders from anybody. And then you say, now you have to take orders, and they're not very keen on that idea. And their idea about Canada is that it's full of Indian savages who scalp and torture people, and it's full of former Tories who like to help Indians to scalp and torture people. So they get into Canada, and they look around, and they see some nice farms and some nice villages, and they start to scatter and go and loot, and occasionally set fire to things, because they like to see things burn. So the American government says, not our fault. But they never court-martialed any of the officers who should have controlled this, and they never court-martialed any of the soldiers who engaged in this behavior. And the American troops end up retreating because it makes Canadians very angry when you burn their farms or loot their farms. And so as the war goes on, more and more Canadians get off the fence and fight very fiercely to repel these people. So the reason why they're coming in, burning and looting and then leaving is because the burning and looting offends so many Canadians that the resistance becomes much fiercer and they are compelled to retreat.
I want to follow up on the Aboriginal angle you talked about there, because there are some absolutely chilling passages in your book of descriptions of mass slaughters, of scalpings, and then on the other hand, of native warriors making a huge ruckus outside a fort.
Right.
British commanders saying, I can't hold them back, and Americans giving up without a shot being fired.
Right.
Talk about how that worked its way through this war.
Okay, that's a good point. Now, the thing about scalping is that people on both sides is scalping. And indeed, some of the chief American troops in the invasion of Canada came from Kentucky. And the people of Kentucky at that time took pride in their fighting ability in the Indian style. And many of these people were very aggressive about collecting as many scalps as they possibly could. So British officers had, at the start of the war, persuaded their Indian warriors to give up their traditional practice of scalping, because they knew Americans made great propaganda hay out of the British use of Indian allies and the scalping practice. So, but then the very first scalp that was taken in the war was a Kentuckian killed an Indian and went and scalped him. Well, the Indians were so upset about this, they carried the body into the British military encampment and said, "This is what the Kentuckians do. Don't tell us ever again not to scalp." So both sides are scalping in this war. But most of the American troops were not Kentuckians. They came from New England, they came from upstate New York, they came from Pennsylvania. They did not have any previous experience with Indian warfare. They had grown up reading stories, horror stories about Indians as murderous savages. They're not trained, you put them into combat, they're in the woods in Canada, and they hear these shrieks and screams, which is what warriors do to work up their courage and to terrify the other side. And then they see these painted Indian warriors that are right out of the nightmares of these Americans. And a lot of these Americans at that point throw their guns down and run. Or they look for the nearest British officer and say, "Please accept our surrender and protect us." Now, not all do that, but a lot do it, particularly in the first year and a half of the war. So the British figure this out, and the First Nations people, leaders figure this out, and they start to conduct the war in a very theatrical fashion, displaying Indians, telling the Americans, I'm not sure I can control these people. If we capture you, I hope you like being burned at the stake. Now, they were playing this up. There's this one case where Native peoples captured an American officer and they were playing around, tormenting him. Nothing particularly serious. And this guy was terrified. He turned to a British officer and said, "Please, I'll do anything, get me free." And the British officer goes to the Indians and say, you can't kill this guy. You've got to keep him as a prisoner. And the Indians say, "Don't worry, we just want to scare him so he won't come back."
Okay. I want to mention a few battles here, which I suspect the audience will be familiar with, and then I want you to give me some sort of quick hits on what the significance of those battles are and why we remember them 200 years later. October 1812, one of the very first and most important battles, Queenston Heights. Significance of that battle?
Significance is it's the second American attempt to invade Canada. It's almost as disastrous as the first. In the morning, the Americans cross the river, Niagara River, capture Queenston Heights. Things are looking good. Brock leads a counterattack, gets killed. British have to retreat, and then they mount a second counterattack later in the afternoon, sweep the Americans from the hill, and First Nations people were essential to that particular victory, and it's 900 Americans end up prisoners, including 23 Irish Americans, who are then held hostage for much of the rest of the war under the threat of being hung as traitors.
April 1813, the destruction of Fort York here in Toronto. Significance of that?
Significance of that, lots of significance. One is that there's an explosion of a magazine and all of the stone comes collapsing down on an American unit, killing the general officer, Zebulon Pike, who was a great hero in America. And American troops and officers believed this was very dirty play. It was unintentional. It didn't intend to kill all those Americans, but even if it had, that was the point of war. But Americans thought that this was cheating. So they got into York, and the town fathers of York thought they had negotiated an understanding with the American commanders that they would control their troops and not loot the town. But the troops got out of control, and they pretty thoroughly looted the town. And some of them went into the Parliament buildings and claimed that they found a human scalp stuck on the wall next to the official mace, which was a symbol of British government. Now, it's pretty implausible that there was a scalp tacked to the wall of the Parliament buildings. But people don't act on what's true, they act on what they believe is true. So these sailors then got out of control and burned the buildings, the Parliament buildings. And then this is something that's considered a great outrage and will be one of the inspirations for the British determination to burn public buildings when they capture Washington, D.C. in the next year of the war.
If you grew up in Hamilton and you went to high school, one of the places that you used to go to neck with your best girl in a car was a place where they had one of the most brutal battles in the War of 1812. July 1814, Lundy's Lane. That's a true story about Hamilton, incidentally. I don't know that from personal experience, I've heard.
Did you grow up in Hamilton?
I did indeed.
Okay.
Yes. Significance of Lundy's Lane?
Well, I never would have predicted that in the future Lundy's Lane would be a center of romance. Lundy's Lane, when it occurred in the summer of 1814, was the bloodiest battle up to that point in the war. It was a night battle. Night battles are especially, all battles are confusing. Sometimes you read these accounts, war accounts, and it seems so neat. Generals order this unit there and that unit there, and it looks like you're playing a board game. You know where all the pieces go. Battles, as far as I can tell, never work that way, because they're absolutely chaotic in all the variables that are in play. And there's just dense smoke over the battlefield, and there's thunderous sound, and people are scared. And inevitably orders go askew, and people do what they're not supposed to do, or they find the landscapes different than they expect. So every battle's chaotic and gets out of the control of its commanders pretty quickly. Then you add the feature of night. This battle began at dusk, and the two sides were so determined to hammer each other, they just kept fighting through the night. And so you got confusion, and you can't tell from the language who you're fighting against. And so units got mixed up. One of the British generals thought he was among his own troops, and it turns out he was among American troops, and they grabbed him. This happened to some Americans too. There are points where people were shooting, and it turns out they were shooting at people of their own side. It's just a hideous battle. And at the end of the battle, the two armies are just so exhausted, they're both, staggered down to their respective sides of the hill. And so this hill, which is symbolic as to who's going to claim victory, is there. And there's some broken down cannon there, which were prime trophies of battle. So whoever in the morning can go and reclaim the hill and grab those cannon and take them off is going to claim victory. But the Americans were so broken down by this battle that their two top generals had both been crippled with wounds. And it fell to the third in command, who was a cautious man, who said, this army's shattered. It's not worth it for those cannon to go and risk the entire destruction of this army. So they retreated all the way down to Fort Erie. And the crippled commander of the American army was just cursing his replacement the whole way because he wanted the honor of those cannon. And the British managed to get the cannon then and to claim victory. But the Americans would never concede that it was a British victory on that day. But given the enormous carnage on both sides, just the butcher's bill, and what the military surgeons, it fell mostly to British military surgeons, because the Americans had to leave most of their most grievously wounded soldiers behind. And they're just basically amputating limbs one after another. And they're doing this in barns. They don't have sanitary conditions for hospitals. And they've got to amputate just as quickly as possible. It's the grimmest possible conditions. So it's almost meaningless who can claim victory when you are left with such carnage on both sides.
Here are the numbers. 171 dead, 572 wounded on the American side, 84 British troops dead, 559 wounded on the British side. Lundy's Lane. One more battle. You're doing very well. He had laryngitis when he walked in here tonight. I'm surprised you've done as well as you have.
Thank you.
Let's do one more battle. This one was strange because I think we've been taught by history that because it happened after the war was technically over, it wasn't all that important. But it certainly was to the career of a guy named Andrew Jackson. Battle of New Orleans, February 1815. Significance thereof.
Well, it's January of 1815.
January, okay.
Yeah. There's this great myth that the battle was fought after the peace had been resolved. And the reason it's a myth is that there had been a peace treaty signed in December of 1814. But that treaty did not go into effect until it's ratified by both sides. And it's stipulated there in the treaty. And the treaty is not ratified by the United States until the middle of February of 1815. So the Battle of New Orleans is while the war is still going on. Now that feature was put in the treaty because the British didn't trust the Americans. They had a track record of negotiating treaties in Europe and then rewriting them in Washington. And the British said, you have to accept this as a package, no changes, and when you do that and ratify it, the war ends. The Battle of New Orleans is one of the most important battles in the history of North America. Because if the British had grabbed control of New Orleans, it controls the mouth of the Mississippi, the vast watershed at the heart of North America. It was a region that was very, very tenuously part of the United States at that point. Louisiana's population was mostly French. And there were a lot of slaves there who didn't like being slaves. It was a situation in which the British could have wreaked a great deal of havoc on the American economy and the American political system if the war had gone on. Also, it's such a one-sided American victory. Massive casualties on the British side and almost none on the American. And it's the favorite battle of Americans, because the British do exactly what American stereotype of the British says they'll do, which is to mass nice red masses of men in charged and entrenched position of Americans who simply have to shoot at them. This is one of very few battles where that happened. But it did happen at New Orleans, and it makes Andrew Jackson, the American commander's reputation, and he will become a president of the United States. But it also has a very long, enduring impact on British thinking about war in North America. They become quite clear that they don't want to invade North America ever again, if they can help it. And it's one of the prime reasons, then, that the British, over the next 2 years, will abandon their Indian allies within the United States. When the Americans start to put the screws to those allies, and those Indian allies turn to the British in Canada and say, we helped you, why aren't you helping us? And they would say, these officials would say to them, we'd love to help you, but we have orders from London to stand down. Sorry. And one of the prime reasons they have orders to stand down is the British don't want another war with the United States because of that one-sided crushing defeat they suffered at New Orleans.
Alan, let's do 2 more questions, you and me, 2 more quick ones, and then you can see there's a microphone in the middle of the room. We'll get everybody else involved who wants to ask a question. You know, apropos of Mr. Ainsley's funny story off the top, let me ask you, who won the War of 1812?
You know, I thought that would be the first question I would be asked, yeah.
I had to give away the ending right off the top. I wasn't going to do that.
Right. Well, I have to leave this room, and I'm outnumbered. It's certainly clear that Canadians and the British and their First Nations allies won the war to defend Canada. The Americans, however, won the war to conquer the West. And the peace treaty is this very important pivot. The peace treaty really betrays the interests of Canada and First Nations peoples. First Nations peoples had been promised that the British would help them set up a buffer zone within what had been the United States, south of the Great Lakes, what's now Michigan, Wisconsin, parts of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, to be an Indian country. And that would have served as a buffer zone to help to protect Canada, because that cluster of Indian peoples would be affiliated with British Canada. Now we could play the counterfactual issue. How would Canada have been different if those Indian peoples had been associated with Canada and eventually had become part of Canada, and inevitably many of those lands would have been settled by immigrants coming via the St. Lawrence, and you would have had Canadian provinces in Wisconsin and Michigan. That would have been greatly enhanced, kind of the depth of the temperate zone for Canada, and would have greatly increased Canada's position in the world. Now, the United States manages to get the British to abandon the buffer zone and to abandon plans to give the British a monopoly of naval power in the Great Lakes, which they were also seeking, which also would have enhanced Canada's security in the future. And then when the Americans after the war are able to basically crush Indian resistance within these generous boundaries the United States secures, it's going to guarantee that the United States will be the dominant power in North America and will be in a position in the 20th century to become the greatest superpower in the world.
Last question. Why is this war not named something more original?
Well, they couldn't come up with an alternative. Sometimes Americans would say it's the second war for American independence. But that was a hard sell. And sometimes they'd call it the Canadian War. But the fact was they were fighting it on the high seas, the Gulf Coast, the Atlantic coast as well. And so they settled on the War of 1812, even though it's a war of 1813 and 1814 and 1815 too. So we're now stuck with it.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your turn now. We're going to take questions for Alan Taylor on his book. There's a microphone in the middle there. So by all means, snuggle up to the mic. And if you like, tell us who you are and where you're from, and then fire away.
Bonjour, Padabin Migazekwe Dishnikaz, Dodam Bene Nipissing Nadanjaba. My English name is Catherine Brooks. I would like you to tell why Tecumseh was able to successfully create a large group of different kinds of Indian nations together to fight in the War of 1812. And secondarily, I'd like you to tell about the role of the Nipissings.
Okay,
just for I suspect everybody knows, but just in case, remind us who Tecumseh was, and then to her question.
Well, Tecumseh, his ethnicity was Shawnee, but he had a vision of pan-Indian unity. He wanted to unite all of, I'm sorry I keep slipping using Indian, but that's what we use on the U.S. side. First Nations peoples, Indian peoples throughout North America. He wasn't the first person to have this vision. It goes back to a leader among the Ottawa named Pontiac, who had also pushed for this back in the 1760s. Tecumseh was an extremely charismatic man, an extraordinary public speaker. He was a man of extraordinary courage. And that was essential if you're going to inspire other warriors to go into combat with you. And so he had a reputation and a lot of clout. And he used that on behalf of this idea of Native peoples setting aside their differences with one another and uniting to defend their homeland as a common homeland, rather than many separate homelands. And he also benefited from his brother, Tenskwatawa, who was a prophet, a visionary, who had had visionary encounters with the Master of Life, who had given a message saying that Native peoples had to unite. And they had to change their ceremonies, and they had to revitalize their traditional way of life if they were to survive as distinct peoples.
He was killed in battle, though, right?
Tecumseh was killed in battle on the Battle of the Thames in the fall of 1813. So his death is a crushing blow to the dream of this pan-Indian or pan-First Nation concept, which is something that the United States is committed to destroying.
How about a word about the Nipissing?
You know, I know next to nothing that's specific about the Nipissing.
They fought in the War of 1812
Yes,
with Tecumseh. But it was also motivated because there was a huge massacre, wasn't it? The reasons the Indians participated was because the Americans were killing them.
Well, there was an attack on a place called Prophetstown. Now, there was a long history of Americans attacking native villages and committing atrocities. Now, one of the attacks is on a place called Prophetstown in what's now Indiana, which was where Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh lived. And there's a lot of people who are killed in that attack. And the American commander on that day was William Henry Harrison. And William Henry Harrison would, 2 years later, be the commander at the Battle of the Thames, in the battle that killed Tecumseh. Tecumseh had not been in the Battle of Tippecanoe, which is what the battle will derive the name from, near Prophetstown. He'd been away, which is one of the reasons why Harrison was able to capture that village. But he is at the Battle of the Thames, and Harrison and his men will succeed in killing him there.
Hi, my name is Paul, and I live here in Toronto. I have a question. I know from a Canadian point of view, the vast majority of the land conflict was in essentially Upper Canada, Ontario. There was some fighting in Quebec. But what about Atlantic Canada, especially, let's say, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia? Was there any type of conflict there, especially land conflict?
There's virtually nothing in the way of land conflict. Occasionally an American privateer, private warship, for-profit warship, would land on the coast of Nova Scotia and plunder some fishermen. But that's it. Now, why is there not much land combat? It's because the Royal Navy controls the Bay of Fundy. And it's very hard to attack the Maritimes unless you have naval supremacy, which the United States did not have. Also, the New England states were the region in which the Federalists were strongest, and they were adamantly opposed to the war. And they refused to allow their state militias to participate in any military activity. So American war planners pretty early took the maritime provinces off the agenda. Now, the Maritimes are very important for a couple of reasons in the war. They are bases for the Royal Navy, especially Halifax, and for Canadian privateers that were very active attacking American merchant ships. And also, there's this very robust smuggling trade that enriches a lot of people in Nova Scotia and a few in New Brunswick, because Americans then as now like their imported consumer goods. Only then they didn't get them from China. They got them from Britain. And so there is this very active smuggling trade with the Federalist merchants of New England that is going through the Maritimes.
Thank you for that
Thank
question.
you very much.
Thank you. Next person, please.
It was interesting in your book to discover how politicized the U.S. Army was at the beginning of the war, and then by the final Niagara campaign, you had people like Jacob Brown, Winfield Scott rising. How was the U.S. Army able to depoliticize itself?
Well, basically, the political appointees turn out to be such hacks that they lose their battles and they get captured. And that means they have to, on the American side, promote people from the middle ranks on up. Now, Jacob Brown was a political appointee too, but occasionally you just through dumb luck, you get somebody who's a political appointee who can grow into the job. And that was Jacob Brown. Jacob Brown was smart enough to know what he didn't know. So he relied very heavily on Winfield Scott, who was a professional soldier. He'd been in the American Army before the war. He'd been in the Army for at least 5 years when the war began. Very well-read man, very ambitious, hyper-ambitious. And basically, Brown turned over the management of his army and the drilling of his army to Scott. And Scott was a formidable man. He was 6'4", probably about 225 pounds of muscle. And he could swear more eloquently than anybody in the American Army. So you didn't want to cross Winfield Scott. And he terrified the American troops into actually developing some discipline. So by the end of the war, it's through that process of attrition that helps to bring to the forefront some people with some actual military ability, and it helps to improve the quality of the American soldier by the end of the war.
When the Americans declared war, I think you were referring to this earlier, but you didn't say the name. It was John Jacob Astor, who was the fur magnate who had a tremendous stake in seeing that all of his furs and his lines of supply were maintained. And so he sent an emissary over the border after he found out about the declaration of war, so that this emissary then told the British, and that Isaac Brock knew about the declaration before the Americans did in Mackinac out in in northern Lake Michigan. And I wanted to know, how could that not possibly be conceived as treason?
Okay, that's an excellent question. There are kind of two parts to it. First is to just flesh in the details of that story, which is that John Jacob Astor, a very wealthy man, is in effect a one-man multinational corporation. He had business interests in Canada in the fur trade, and he didn't want his furs on the Canadian side of the border to be confiscated by the British, so he wanted news of the war to get to his trading partners. Well, it turns out that in the United States of 1812, there was already insider trading. John Jacob Astor is the best of friends with the American Secretary of the Treasury, who tells Astor that the war has been declared. And Astor hires a faster rider than the U.S. government engages, and rides all the way up to Niagara, gets across the river, tells his contact in what's now Niagara-on-the-Lake, who then tells Isaac Brock. Isaac Brock then arrests the American officers who were over visiting Niagara-on-the-Lake on a social call with no clue that war had been declared. Brock then sends word to a British officer up on Lake Huron and says, you know, I think it would be a good idea to go over and grab Mackinac before the Americans know what hits them. And that's exactly what happened. So the American commander is surrounded suddenly by this mixed force of French Canadians, small number of British, and a very large number of Indian warriors who paint themselves to the max and do the performance for the benefit of the American soldiers, who then say, we surrender. And it turns out that a lot of those soldiers were themselves French Canadians who had enlisted on the American side. So they were told, you know, you are now traitors against the king because Quebec's part of the empire. So we could hang you, or you could enlist in British forces. They decided to enlist in British forces. Now, a lot of them had enlisted in British forces in the past. There was a lot of going back and forth to get bounties from different sides. So then the question becomes, why isn't John Jacob Astor and his emissary, he's kind of the reverse of Paul Revere, because he rides to the British to say the Americans are coming.
Yes. Interesting.
Why, you know, they arrest this guy Vosburgh, but they can't make the charge stick. Why can't they? Yeah. Because the American law of treason at that point set such a high threshold that the only way you would qualify as a traitor is if you went over to the British side, picked up a gun, and shot an American. You have to be found in arms fighting against the United States. So simply conveying this business information to the other side, while it is disastrous for the American war effort, does not qualify as treason under the Constitution of the United States as it was in 1812.
Ladies and gentlemen, I got to be a bit of a bad guy here. Alan's voice has really had a workout, so let's take two more questions and then we're going to give him a break. First one, please.
Charles Ritchie, I admit I haven't read your book, and what you said in the talk earlier was something of a surprise to me, that you said that there were, at 1812, there were either 100 or 1,000 ships in the Royal Navy and only 10 in the U.S. of A.
I said 21 for the U.S.
That's right. What I'm surprised is that, presuming there was that large amount of ships in the Royal Navy in the War of Independence in 1776, why then did the UK armies lose in that conflict? And was it basically ineptness vis-a-vis losing the Battle of New Orleans? Because I presume there were a number of ships available then that could be used to fight that battle.
Okay, so the question about the Revolution is why did the British lose that earlier war? At that time, partly as the Royal Navy wasn't as big as it would become in 1812. The British Navy goes through this massive expansion during the Napoleonic Wars. Second reason is the French and the Spanish entered the war as allies of the United States. This is during the Revolution. And at that time, the French Navy had undergone some very significant reforms. And the French Navy did a pretty good job of fighting the British in that war. And indeed, they won what is arguably the most important naval battle of the Revolution, which was they occupied the mouth of Chesapeake Bay. And when a British fleet tried to break through to relieve the British Army of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown in Virginia, the French repelled the British attack. And that meant that Lord Cornwallis in 1781 had to surrender. And it is that defeat that is politically crushing to Lord North's administration in England. And so a peace administration comes in, and it will lead to peace negotiations in 1782. So it's really the combination, then, of French and Spanish naval power that helps the United States to win the war sufficiently on land in the Revolution.
Thank you. Last question, please.
Alan Hooks, a history teacher. I was wondering how historians like yourself and many others who write on the War of 1812 can draw on such confident information about Tecumseh and often quote some of his speeches. And I'm wondering what the sources are for that.
Well, there are a number of sources. One is that British officers in particular, but also American officers when they would be engaged in any negotiations with Tecumseh, were fascinated by him. And they would record in their journals translations of what he had said. And there is also a phenomena called council minutes. Whenever the American, British, or French officials would have a formal discussion with First Nations peoples, there would be secretaries and translators there, and an exchange of very formal speeches, which would be written down in the language of the colonial power. So this does come through a filter. And it's been an interpretive question among historians as to how much of what's recorded is authentically the words of First Nations people. Now, one wouldn't like to throw those sources entirely out, because we would like to know what the words were of First Nations people, and these are our best chances to get them in written documents. Now, of course, there are also oral traditions among Native peoples, and that's another source for what we understand about Tecumseh. But to go back to the council records for a minute, often they say things that are very insulting to the colonial people recording this, basically laying out their misdeeds. One of the most famous speeches that Tecumseh is supposed to have said, it was delivered in Amherstburg when Henry Proctor was preparing to retreat. And Proctor is trying to persuade the First Nations people, and especially Tecumseh, that they have no choice but to retreat. And Tecumseh, in that recorded speech, refers to Proctor as being like a fat animal with his tail between his legs. So I think, and a lot of historians think, that if we are careful with those council minutes, that we can find the sentiments of First Nations peoples.
Ladies and gentlemen, just before I pass this over to Tina to wrap things up, I know you want to join me in thanking Alan Taylor. I've read the book. It was fantastic. Just a great book. Well done. That was superb. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.